Within 10 years of television entering American homes, the family dinner table was gone. Children were sleeping less, and entire industries had collapsed. Nobody noticed because they were all watching the same screen. In the summer of 1950, if you knocked on the front door of any house on any residential street in most American cities, the odds were better than 9 to 1 that there was no television set inside. The family that lived there woke up to radio in the mornings. They ate dinner at the table every single night. The children came home from school, listened to serial adventure programs on the living room radio, and went to bed when their parents decided the day was over. On weekends, they went to the movies. On evenings when no favorite program was scheduled, they sat on the porch, walked to a neighbor's house, or played cards around the kitchen table. That was not an idealized version of American domestic life. It was just the ordinary structure of things, the infrastructure of daily living that had accumulated over decades, built around habits that the entire household understood and observed. 10 years later, almost everything about that picture had changed. By 1960, nearly 9 out of 10 American homes had a television set. The family was still eating, but often in front of a screen. The children were still going to bed, but later than before and more reluctantly. The radio still existed, but it had retreated into the background, stripped of the programs that had once drawn the family into the same room. The movie theaters were struggling. The front porch visits were less frequent. The kitchen table was still there, but it was competing with something it had never competed with before. A glowing rectangle in the living room that could show you the world without requiring you to leave your chair. This is the story of how that transition happened and what it actually cost. Not what television's critics said it cost, not the hand-wringing of moral reformers or newspaper columnists who felt displaced. What it actually documentably cost, measured in family routines disrupted, habits abandoned, institutions quietly dismantled, and ways of living that vanished so gradually that most Americans barely noticed they were gone. There are 20 distinct ways that television reshaped the American family. Some are well remembered, others have been almost entirely forgotten. All of them are real, and all of them began in that extraordinary decade between 1950 and 1960, when an entire nation rearranged itself around a box that nobody had asked for and almost nobody could resist. The first thing television did was destroy the American dinner table. Not all at once and not completely, but systematically, structurally, and with a speed that social scientists of the era found alarming once they started measuring it. To understand what was lost, you have to understand what the dinner table actually was before television arrived. It was not just a place where food was consumed. In the American family of the 1940s, the evening meal was a structured daily institution. It had a time, roughly 5:30 or 6 o'clock, and that time was treated as something close to a deadline. Children were expected to be home. Fathers were expected to be back from work. Mothers had typically spent some portion of the afternoon preparing the meal, because the meal itself was understood as the organizing event of the family's evening. Everything before it was preliminary. Everything after, it happened in the context of the household having already gathered, already shared food, already sat down together. The dinner table was where children heard about problems their parents were navigating. It was where parents could ask about school, about friendships, about the small daily frictions of a child's life. One researcher studying American families in the early 1950s described it directly. The family dinner hour had always been a time when parents could discuss with their children what was right or wrong about what had happened in the day. It was a daily checkpoint, not always warm, not always rich with conversation, but a reliable, recurring moment of family accountability that no other structure in the household provided.
Television did not set out to eliminate this. What it did was offer something scheduled right at the same time, passive, entertaining, and enormously appealing to every member of the family simultaneously. By the time social scientists began studying the impact on family routines in the early 1950s, they had already found something striking. In one surveyed group of families, 1/6 of the children were eating dinner in front of the television set every single night. Nearly half were eating in front of the television 2 or 3 times a week. The family dinner hour, one researcher said plainly, had in some families simply evaporated. This was not a slow generational drift. It happened almost immediately after the television arrived. Families that had eaten at the table every evening for decades began within weeks of getting a set, rearranging their routines around the broadcast schedule. The meal that had once been the fixed center of the evening became negotiable, subject to revision based on what was on that night. The furniture of American homes reflected this change almost immediately. The TV tray, a small folding stand designed to hold a plate in front of a seated viewer, became a standard household item by the mid-1950s. Department stores sold them in sets of 4, one for each member of a typical family. The expectation was not that 1 or 2 family members might occasionally eat in front of the television. The expectation was that the entire family would do it regularly enough to justify owning a dedicated piece of furniture for the purpose. What replaced the dinner table conversation? In the short term, the television program itself. Families were physically in the same room, but oriented toward the screen rather than toward each other. The conversation that had once moved around the table was replaced by commentary on what was being watched. The questions a parent might have asked a child about school, the update a husband might have given a wife about a problem at work, all of it was compressed, postponed, or dropped entirely. The institution that had guaranteed a daily moment of family assembly, one that had existed in American homes for as long as there had been American homes, had been permanently weakened within a single decade. The second transformation came in a cardboard box designed to look like a miniature television set. The story of the TV dinner begins with a bird. In the fall of 1953, the Nebraska-based food company C.A. and Swanson and Sons found itself in possession of approximately 520,000 pounds of leftover Thanksgiving turkey, 260 tons of it sitting in 10 refrigerated railroad cars that could only maintain temperature while in motion. So Swanson kept the trains moving back and forth between Nebraska and the East Coast while company executives tried to figure out what to do with the most expensive pile of leftover Thanksgiving dinner in American history. The solution was to pack the turkey, along with cornbread stuffing, sweet potatoes, and buttered peas, into a compartmentalized aluminum tray of the kind that airlines were already using for in-flight meals. Print the box to look like a television set, complete with fake tuning knobs, sell it for 98 cents, and market it to a country that was, at that exact moment, in the middle of a national love affair with the new appliance in their living rooms. The Swanson TV dinner went on sale in 1954. The company had estimated it might sell 5,000 units. It sold more than 10 million in the first year. The following year, 25 million. By 1956, Swanson was moving 13 million TV dinners annually, even as competitors entered the market. The frozen meal industry became, in the space of 2 or 3 years, a national phenomenon built almost entirely on the premise that eating in front of the television was no longer an occasional compromise, but a regular, expected feature of American family life. The woman who actually made the TV dinner work was not a salesman or a marketing executive. Her name was Betty Cronin, and she was 21 years old when Swanson hired her as a bacteriologist in 1953. The problem she was handed was a genuine technical challenge. How do you design a frozen meal in which the turkey, the sweet potatoes, the peas, and the stuffing all reach a safe eating temperature in the same oven time? Cronin solved it and was later promoted to Director of Product Development at Swanson. Her contribution, the one that made it physically possible to eat the product without getting sick, has been largely overlooked in the popular retelling of the story.
On the symbolic level, the TV dinner represented something significant. The first time an American food product had been explicitly designed to be consumed in front of a screen rather than at a table. Every choice that went into it, the single serving size, the compartmentalized portions, the oven-ready convenience, was built around the assumption that the primary purpose of dinner was no longer conversation or gathering. It was sustenance, time to fit between programs. By 1962, Swanson removed the TV dinner name from its packaging, but the original name captured something permanent. An entire product category had been created specifically to accommodate the restructuring of the American evening meal around a broadcast schedule. The packaging was later inducted into the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of American History, recognized as an artifact that had helped define what American domestic life became in the second half of the 20th century. The third transformation was the quietest, because it happened to something that most Americans had already stopped noticing was there. Radio had been the dominant entertainment technology in the American home from the early 1920s through the late 1940s. Not just a background presence, a central one. In 1947, a survey by the C.E. Hoper Research Organization found that 82 out of every 100 Americans were regular radio listeners. Families had specific programs they followed, specific times they sat down to listen. Children came home from school to catch adventure serials. Fathers tuned in for the evening news. The whole family gathered after dinner for the comedy programs, Fibber McGee and Molly, The Jack Benny Show, the Lux Radio Theater. These were not passive entertainments. They required imagination. Radio was a medium of sound without image, which meant that every listener's mind was actively constructing the world being described, the faces, the settings, the physical dimensions of a story told entirely in words, sound effects, and music. Television took that shared experience and made it visual, and in doing so, it changed the nature of the experience entirely. Radio shows that had run for years moved directly to television in the early 1950s. Jack Benny moved, Burns and Allen moved, The Lone Ranger made the jump, Amos and Andy made the jump. The program survived, more or less, but the medium changed everything. Where radio had asked listeners to imagine, television showed. Where radio required active mental participation, television permitted passive reception. You could watch television and do nothing else at all. Listening to radio without images required your mind to supply what the medium withheld. By the mid-1950s, the variety shows, dramas, and comedy programs that had defined radio's golden age had largely migrated to the screen. What remained on radio was narrower: news and weather, sports play-by-play, music. Radio became a medium for the car, for the kitchen background, for the solo listener. It ceased to be the thing the family gathered around. And the transfer cost something that was not immediately visible because the loss was a quality rather than a quantity. What radio had demanded of its listeners, and what those listeners had provided every evening for 3 decades, was imagination. Television did not make that demand. It made the opposite one. The fourth thing television changed was where Americans went on a Saturday night, or more precisely, whether they went anywhere at all. In 1946, movie theater attendance in the United States reached its all-time peak. The war was over, money was available, and the movie theater was the primary venue for shared entertainment outside the home. The decline that followed had more than one cause: suburban development, the baby boom, but the single most powerful force was the television set in the living room. In 1950, a poll commissioned by Paramount Pictures found that families with a television had decreased their moviegoing by somewhere between 20 and 30%. A Warner Brothers poll in 1951 found that television ownership was already responsible for a 3 to 4% drop in the overall American film audience. By 1956, theater attendance had fallen almost 50% from its 1946 peak. The movie palace was hemorrhaging audiences to a machine that offered entertainment without travel, without cost per viewing, and without the need to arrange a babysitter. Hollywood's response was creative. If television was a small screen, movies would become spectacularly large. CinemaScope arrived in 1953. Cinerama used 3 synchronized projectors to fill a curved screen. 3D glasses appeared briefly and uncomfortably. The studios invested in epic productions, Ben-Hur, The Ten Commandments, Lawrence of Arabia, experiences that were simply impossible to reproduce on a 12-inch television screen. At the same time, and more quietly, Hollywood began selling its catalog to television. In 1955, Warner Brothers sold the broadcast rights to its entire pre-1950 film library for $21 million. The studios had spent years treating television as an existential threat. Now they were selling their archives to fill it. But the cultural cost of the movie theater's decline was real and lasting. The theater had been more than a place to watch films. It had been a public gathering space, one of the few places where people from different neighborhoods, different income levels, and different backgrounds sat together in the dark and experienced the same story at the same time. The transition of entertainment from the public space of the theater to the private space of the living room was part of a broader withdrawal from community life that television both reflected and accelerated. The fifth transformation was the one that happened to Saturday morning. Before television, Saturday morning was not a designated children's time. It was simply the morning of a day when school was not in session. Children played outside, did chores, accompanied parents on errands. There was no broadcast event that structured the morning or that children waited for with anticipation. Television created Saturday morning as a children's institution. It emerged gradually from the discovery that children between the ages of roughly 4 and 12 represented a massive and largely untapped television audience, and that they were at home on Saturday mornings with access to the set at a time when their parents were often still sleeping. The children who found the television in the early 1950s found it on their own terms, without adult supervision, and the networks found them. What Saturday morning television created was a new kind of weekly ritual for American children, one that was commercially designed and commercially structured from the beginning. The networks understood that a child watching Saturday morning television was a child being delivered at low cost and high efficiency to the advertisers who sponsored the programming. The cereal companies understood it too. General Mills and Kellogg's and Post competed fiercely for Saturday morning time because Saturday morning was direct access to the children who would ask their parents for the product on the next trip to the grocery store. The routine that Saturday morning television created was understood by everyone who lived through it. You woke up early, earlier often than you woke up for school. You went downstairs quietly so as not to wake your parents. You poured cereal from a box covered in cartoon imagery and sat in front of the television until someone made you stop. The unstructured morning hours that had previously been free time were now organized around a broadcast schedule as reliably as any school day. The only difference was that no adult had arranged this schedule. The television and the networks and the advertisers had done it. The Saturday morning cartoon block ran from roughly the mid-1950s through the late 1990s. A child who grew up in the 1960s or 1970s remembers Saturday morning television as one of the defining rituals of childhood. A child growing up now has never experienced it. The Cartoon Network and Nickelodeon and Disney Plus deliver children's programming around the clock, which means the specific Saturday morning ritual, the early rising, the quiet cereal in the blue dark of the living room, the weekly schedule, no longer exists as a shared experience. The sixth transformation is the one that no parent of the 1950s needed a researcher to document because they were living it in real time every evening. Children in households with television went to bed later than children without television. The research from the early 1950s was consistent. Children in television homes were going to bed on average about half an hour later than non-television homes. That half hour sounds modest until you add context. Children who had been on a 7 o'clock schedule were now negotiating for 7:30 or 8 o'clock, and the negotiation was the key element because the dynamic was not parental decision but parental erosion.
The researcher who documented this was precise about the mechanism. The more representative case was the parent who was watching an engrossing program and found themselves susceptible to a child's petition to stay up and watch the end, or the parent who had, on the course of a few months, simply stopped thinking of bedtime as a fixed event and started thinking of it as a suggestion subject to revision based on what the broadcast schedule offered that evening.
The behavioral consequences were observable without research instruments. Children who went to bed later were harder to wake in the morning, harder to teach, harder to manage. Teachers in communities where television had arrived earlier than in neighboring districts began reporting changes in children's classroom behavior that correlated in a general way with the spread of the technology. The bedtime problem was also a symptom of a larger shift in household authority that television accelerated. Before television, the evening routine of an American household was governed by clear parental decisions: when dinner was served, when children did their homework, when children went to bed. Television complicated all three, and parents who had previously held firm authority over the evening hours found themselves, with surprising frequency, conceding ground to a machine. The seventh transformation happened to books and to the habit of reading them. American households in the 1940s read more than their counterparts in the following decades. Before television provided passive evening entertainment, reading was one of the primary alternatives to silence. Adults who wanted to be absorbed in a narrative read novels. Children who wanted to be entertained read. Magazines circulated through households at rates that would be unrecognizable today. Life magazine reached millions of families every week. The Saturday Evening Post, Collier's Weekly, and Look were genuine reading events, publications that families worked through over the course of several days. A 1950 to 1951 study of 622 children in Boston, matched by age, sex, and economic background into television and non-television households, found that book reading, radio listening, and movie attendance were all substantially lower in the television group. Total media consumption was higher. The children were consuming more overall, but the form of that consumption had shifted from active to passive, and from imaginative to receptive. The mechanism was partly substitution. Television was taking up hours that had previously been available for reading, and partly something more subtle. Reading requires a kind of focused, continuous attention that is qualitatively different from watching television. A book does not provide its images, the reader must generate them. A book does not set its own pace, the reader controls it. For a child who had grown up primarily with television, the sustained imaginative engagement that reading required was a harder ask. The medium had trained the child's attention differently. The decline in magazine readership was dramatic enough to destroy entire publications. Collier's Weekly ceased publication in 1956. The Saturday Evening Post, a fixture of American domestic life since the 19th century, went through years of painful decline before eventually folding in 1969. These were not publications that died because their content had become irrelevant. They died, in substantial part, because the leisure hours that American families had previously spent reading them were now occupied by television. The eighth transformation was perhaps the most intimate because it happened inside people's understanding of what their own lives were supposed to look like. Television in the 1950s did not merely entertain American families, it told them with remarkable consistency what a family was supposed to be. The sitcoms of the late 1950s and early 1960s, Father Knows Best, Leave It to Beaver, The Donna Reed Show, The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet, presented a version of American domestic life that was white, middle class, suburban, and organized around gender roles as rigid as anything in the Victorian era. The father left for work in the morning wearing a suit. The mother was already there wearing a dress and an apron, preparing dinner, managing children.
The family's difficulties were inconveniences, not crises, and they were always resolved within 30 minutes. These images were not realistic. They were not meant to be. Their power was not documentary, it was normative. Television in the 1950s was not simply reflecting the culture, it was prescribing it. The shows that millions of American families watched together in their living rooms were telling those families, evening after evening, what the proper arrangement of domestic life looked like. For women, the message was specific and narrow. A woman's proper location was the home. Her proper function was to support her husband's life and career, manage the household with efficiency and grace, and raise children who would be a credit to the family. The woman who wanted something beyond this was at best a comic inconvenience, which was, in fact, precisely the joke at the center of I Love Lucy. Lucy Ricardo wanted to be in show business. Her ambitions were the punchline, her failures confirmation that the natural order was the one the show's premise had already established. The frustration and sense of wasted capacity that Betty Friedan would document in The Feminine Mystique in 1963 had been building throughout the 1950s, in part because the gap between the television ideal and the lived reality was wide enough to be painful, and in part because the television ideal was being broadcast with such confident authority that questioning it felt like personal failure rather than cultural critique. The ninth transformation was the one that happened in American stores. Television advertising created a consumer economy of a kind that had not previously existed. A radio advertisement told you about a product. A print advertisement showed you a static image. A television advertisement showed you the product in use, showed you what your kitchen would look like if you had the right appliance, what your life would look like if you drove the right car. Television advertising was, from its earliest days, selling not just products but lifestyles. A study using retail data from the years of the FCC's broadcasting freeze between 1948 and 1952, when no new television stations were licensed, found that counties with television access saw retail sales grow by 3 to 4% more than counties without it. That difference translated to roughly $131 additional in retail spending per median household. Television was, almost from the beginning, a machine for converting viewers into customers. Children were recognized almost immediately as a secondary but enormously powerful market, not because children had money, most of them didn't, but because children had influence. The Saturday morning advertising block delivered a child audience to cereal manufacturers, candy companies, and toy makers. The cereal box became one of the most intensively designed pieces of commercial real estate in the American economy. Tony the Tiger, Cap and Crunch, the Trix Rabbit, these were advertising characters who had been given the trappings of cartoon personalities specifically to make the commercial encounter feel like friendship. Cigarette companies were among the earliest and most financially committed television advertisers. They sponsored programs directly. The Flintstones, which premiered in 1960, was sponsored by Winston Cigarettes, an animated primetime program watched by the same children who were watching Saturday morning cartoons. Television was used to associate smoking with glamour, masculinity, health, and social confidence in ways that reached into American households with an intimacy that no previous medium had offered. This continued until 1971, when a federal ban on cigarette advertising in broadcast media went into effect. The 10th transformation was one that most parents acknowledged with some ambivalence even as they participated in it. Television became, almost from the moment it arrived, a child management tool. Parents discovered quickly that a child seated in front of a television set was a child who was not in the way, not in trouble, not requiring supervision, not fighting with a sibling, not asking for attention that a tired parent did not have available to give. The 1950s social science record is candid about this. A mother quoted in one of the era's research studies was unambiguous. The television was just like putting her son to sleep. She could sit him in front of it, and he would be absorbed and happy and would not be in the way. These were not mothers who were failing their children. They were mothers using the available tools of their time to manage the relentless, never-ending work of raising children in a household that also had cooking and cleaning and shopping and a dozen other demands on their attention. The problem was not that parents used television to manage children's behavior. The problem was what that management cost. A child absorbing 3 to 4 hours of television per day was not developing the tolerance for boredom that leads to creative play, not practicing the social skills that come from negotiating with peers in unstructured environments, not learning the self-direction that comes from being responsible for structuring one's own time. These costs were not visible in the moment. They were visible later in the aggregate, in the research that began accumulating from the 1960s onward. The researchers of the early 1950s noted this with care. The family with a television spent more time in the same physical space than the family without one, but the time of genuine interaction, of parental attention directed at the child rather than at the screen, was drastically reduced. Television had created physical proximity while eroding intimate contact. The family was in the same room and further apart. The 11th transformation is one you can still see in the floor plans of mid-century American homes if you know what to look for. Before television, the living room of an American house was arranged around conversation. The furniture, sofas, armchairs, occasional tables, was oriented inward toward the people in the room. In the 1920s and 1930s, the radio set was incorporated into this arrangement as a piece of furniture. It sat in one corner along a wall, and the family gathered near it. But gathered around described approximate proximity. You sat near the radio to hear it, but the furniture was not specifically aligned to face it. The room was still fundamentally oriented toward its occupants. Television changed this at the architectural level. The screen had to be visible from where you sat, which meant that everyone in the room needed to face the same direction, toward the set. The furniture that had been arranged for conversation began, in the early 1950s, to be rearranged for viewing. In newly built suburban homes of the 1950s, architects and builders began incorporating this reality into their floor plans. The living room was designed around an anticipated television position. One wall was identified as the television wall, and the room was laid out so that seating naturally faced it. The fireplace, the traditional focal point of the American living room for centuries, was repositioned to a side wall or eliminated altogether in the most modern designs. The screen had replaced the fire as the thing you gathered around. A room arranged around a screen is a room organized for watching. A room arranged around a fireplace or a conversation circle is a room organized for being together. Over the course of decades in which American families spent their evenings in rooms designed to direct their attention toward a screen, that distinction was not subtle at all. The 12th transformation was the one that changed the presidency, the nature of public trust in government, and the way Americans understood their relationship to political power. On the evening of September 26, 1960, 70 million Americans watched two men stand at podiums in a Chicago television studio and argue about the future of the country. The candidates were Richard Milhous Nixon, the Vice President of the United States, and John Fitzgerald Kennedy, the junior senator from Massachusetts. By substantive measure, the two men were closely matched. Nixon was more experienced. His foreign policy knowledge was deeper. His grasp of the machinery of government was superior. In the radio audience, the people who listened rather than watched, Nixon either won or drew even. The television audience saw something different. Nixon had been recently hospitalized for a knee injury and had lost weight during his recovery. He wore a shirt that did not fit properly at the collar. He refused stage makeup, while Kennedy accepted it. Nixon appeared on camera looking pale, drawn, and visibly uncomfortable. His 5 o'clock shadow, which would have been invisible to a room full of people, was visible to every viewer in the country. The production of the debate was managed by a 38-year-old CBS producer named Don Hewitt, the same man who would later create 60 Minutes. Kennedy had attended Hewitt's pre-production meeting. Nixon had not. Kennedy's performance in the debate, largely on the basis of his visual presence and composure, is credited by historians as a significant factor in his eventual narrow victory. The election was decided by roughly 100,000 votes across a handful of key states. What is certain is that the debate made visible for the first time the degree to which television had made appearance and manner inseparable from political substance. Television coverage of political events in the early 1960s also began to hold government accountable in ways that print journalism had not, because television was unavoidable. When the civil rights movement placed peaceful demonstrators in the path of fire hoses and police dogs in Birmingham, Alabama, in the spring of 1963, television cameras were present. The images that reached American living rooms that evening were unlike anything a newspaper photograph could convey. The violence was happening, and the television set brought it inside. The 13th transformation was the most politically explosive thing that television had done by the time it did it. The Vietnam War was the first military conflict that came home on television. Every night on the national news broadcasts of ABC, CBS, and NBC, footage of the fighting reached American living rooms in something close to real time. Before television, Americans had experienced war through newsreels in movie theaters, radio reports, and letters from the front. The newsreel showed what the military and film companies chose to show. The radio report described what the correspondent described. The war existed in the American civilian imagination as a constructed narrative. Television changed this. The selections included things that previous wartime media had not shown: the physical reality of combat, the bodies carried from the field, the faces of soldiers who were frightened or exhausted or in pain. When public support for the Vietnam War began to erode in the late 1960s, the television coverage was one of the identified factors. The images of the Tet Offensive in early 1968, which arrived on television screens in a form that contradicted the official government narrative of progress, are credited with accelerating the collapse of public confidence in the Johnson administration's conduct of the war. Walter Cronkite, the CBS News anchor, who was then the most trusted journalist in America, visited Vietnam after Tet and returned to deliver an editorial assessment on air. His conclusion that the war was mired in stalemate carried weight not because Cronkite was the most analytically sophisticated observer, but because he was, for millions of American families, the most trusted voice on the television set in their living room. What Vietnam and television produced together was a permanent change in the relationship between the American public and its government's account of military action. The credibility gap that opened in the late 1960s did not close when the war ended. It established a template for public skepticism about official military narratives that defined American political culture for decades afterward. The 14th transformation bound the country together before it pulled it apart. For roughly 25 years, from the early 1950s through the mid-1970s, television gave the United States something it had never quite had before: a genuinely shared popular culture. Not a culture shared by the elite, or shared by a region, or shared by a demographic. A culture shared by nearly everyone coast to coast, because nearly everyone was watching the same programs on the same 3 networks on the same evenings at the same times. When the Ed Sullivan Show aired on Sunday nights, it was watched by something close to the entire country. When a new episode of The Andy Griffith Show ran on Monday nights, it was a shared experience in a way that very little else in American public life had ever been. The moon landing on July 20th, 1969, was the apotheosis of this. An estimated 600 million people worldwide watched Apollo 11 on television, the largest television audience in history to that point. In the United States, virtually the entire country was watching. Bars and restaurants turned their sets to face the windows. People who did not have televisions went to neighbors' houses to watch. The experience of sitting in one's living room and watching a human being set foot on the surface of the moon, live, was shared by virtually every American who had access to a television set. This capacity for shared national experience would not last. Cable television in the 1970s began fragmenting the national audience. The multiplication of channels in the 1980s accelerated it. By the time streaming services arrived in the 2000s, the shared national television audience had essentially ceased to exist. A television event in the modern era that reaches 20 million viewers is considered a spectacular success. The Ed Sullivan Show, in a country half the size of today's, regularly reached 50 million or more. The 15th through 20th transformations continued the story through gender roles, community life, children's exposure to violence, the rise of televised sports, the normalization of cigarette use, and ultimately the fragmentation of the family viewing experience itself. Each followed the same basic arc. Television arrived in a household and restructured whatever it found there. The dinner table, the radio hour, the movie Saturday, the Saturday morning, the bedtime, the bookshelf, the living room furniture, the political candidate, the war, all of it was touched, and most of it changed, and the changes accumulated over decades into something that is now simply the condition of American domestic life. Normal, unremarkable, and largely invisible as change because it is all most living Americans have ever known. What remains at the end of this accounting is a complicated inheritance. Television gave American families something genuinely extraordinary, a window onto the world that was available without travel, without expense, and without any particular preparation. It brought history into the living room in real time. It made presidential elections comprehensible to ordinary people. It educated sometimes and moved often, and occasionally produced work of such quality that it stood alongside the best of any other medium in any era. But the cost column of this ledger is long. The American family dinner table, the daily institution that had housed a generation's worth of ordinary family conversation and connection, was functionally dismantled within a single decade. The children who grew up eating from aluminum compartments in front of the screen inherited a different relationship to the family meal than any generation before them had had. The reading habits that had structured American family leisure declined measurably and permanently once the passive alternative of the screen was available. The imagination that radio had demanded of its listeners was replaced by the more comfortable passivity of watching. The community life that had existed in the physical spaces of neighborhoods and front porches and bowling leagues and civic clubs was progressively replaced by the private domestic entertainment of the living room screen. The political culture was permanently reshaped around the camera, privileging appearance and manner in ways that had no necessary relationship to governing competence. Children's sleep was disturbed, and their reading hours were reduced. And then television fragmented its own audience, and the one genuine gift it had offered, the shared national experience, the common cultural language, the ability for an entire country to sit down together and watch the same thing at the same time, was undone by the multiplication of channels, the proliferation of sets, and the eventual arrival of the streaming era, which delivered abundant choice at the cost of collective experience. The original television set in the American living room of 1952 was pointed at the family. It required the family to gather. That set has been replaced by a screen in every room, a device in every pocket, a personalized stream of content available to each individual at any hour, requiring no gathering, no shared choice, no negotiation with the other people who happened to live in the same house. The family that television gathered around the screen in the 1950s has been, in the decades since, gradually ungathered by the technology that came after it. That is not television's fault, exactly. Television did not plan for the cable era, and the cable era did not plan for streaming, and none of these technologies set out to dismantle the domestic rituals they found when they arrived. They each, in their time, did what technologies do. They offered something that the people who encountered them found irresistible, and the people who found it irresistible chose it, and in choosing it, they gave up other things that they did not always notice were going until they were already gone. The evening meal at the kitchen table, the sound of the radio in the living room that required you to imagine what you were hearing, the book open on the armchair at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday night, the neighbor you ran into on the front porch because you were both outside for no particular reason, the Saturday afternoon with no scheduled programming and no screen to orient yourself toward, the sleep you were supposed to get. These things survive in households where they are actively chosen, but they no longer exist as defaults, as the natural condition of American domestic life. They have been replaced by defaults designed by engineers and marketers and network executives and streaming algorithms, serving interests which are not necessarily identical to the interests of the families sitting in the rooms where the screens are. That is what television changed. Not a tragedy, because most of what it offered was worth having. Not a victory, because most of what it displaced was also worth having. Just a trade, made, like most trades in American domestic history, at faster than anyone fully understood, and at a price that was only fully visible in retrospect.